There was always a fundamental flaw to the Abraham Accords. You cannot normalize with a country that isn't normal. The experience of modern history has taught Palestinians that those who leave their land are very seldom given the right to return. Not because the international community says so, but because Palestinians say so. Israel was seen as the kind of colonial foothold for Western influence in the region. The hopes that it raised, and then the great disappointments that followed. There is a universal recognition in the international community that there will need to be political changes. So change will come to the Israeli government. It is hard to see how the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can be part of that future. And I know that ultimately the Arab people will prevail, but it's going to happen. My name is Eugene Rogan, and I'm professor of the modern history of the Middle East in the University of Oxford, where I've taught since 1991. But I have spent over 50 years of my life either studying or living in the Middle East, so my connection to the region long predates my professional attachment. I first went to the Middle East in 1971 as a child, when my father, who then worked for an aerospace company, went to open Northrop's office in Beirut for the region. We spent 5 years in Beirut until, with the outbreak of the Civil War, it was no longer safe to remain, and in early 1976, we moved to Cairo. So I had 8 years of my childhood growing up in all of the developments that made the Middle East in the 1970s the most interesting part of the world to study. And I would argue that it has remained the most interesting part of the world right down to the present day. One of the hardest tasks of the historian is to try and analyze atrocity. We study atrocity. We study genocides. We study massacres. We do so not to justify them, but because we have to make sense of why these events happen. And we hope in our analysis to provide guidelines for future generations to not avoid repeating history so much as to avoid repeating historic mistakes. The reshaping of the Arab world following the end of the Ottoman Empire was determined by a set of agreements concluded during the First World War between Russia, France, and Britain. These agreements are most popularly known as Sykes-Picot. But if we look at the war years, we can reveal a kind of ongoing process of what I would call partition diplomacy that begins right at the beginning of the war, and that really begins already in April 1915, what will be an ongoing process of the three wartime allies, Britain, France, and Russia, to talk about not just how to defeat the Ottoman Empire as Germany's ally, but following the defeat of that empire, how to impose a partition on the Ottoman world that would then benefit their respective empires. It's an extraordinary thought because, of course, defeating the Ottomans once the Ottomans entered World War I with Germany was a reasonable war aim for the British and French and Russians. But to presume then to partition this territory and to give the land out amongst themselves as war prizes is the beginning of the original sin of the emergence of the modern Middle East. Because, of course, the Russians, the French, the British never consulted with the people involved in the Arab world to see whether the plans that they were pursuing corresponded in any way to the ambitions of the people who would emerge from the Ottoman world. But the milestones in that partition diplomacy would next follow when Britain concludes a wartime alliance with Sharif Hussein ibn Ali in the Hejaz to launch an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In return for that, the British were willing to recognize Sharif Hussein as king of an Arab land that would, in his own claim, extend from the Mediterranean coast to the Arabian Sea, from the Gulf to the Red Sea. Britain tried to exclude certain territories from that. They designated territories to the west of a line running from Damascus through Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, which they'd already promised to France when France claimed Syria. And then the next thing the British do when they conclude their agreement with Sharif Hussein is to sit down with France and to try and agree the boundaries of French claims. This becomes Sykes-Picot. They wanted to define a post-war world in which the imperial ambitions of Britain, France, and Russia would be satisfied in advance and protect those three powers from ever going to war with each other over colonial differences. And in this way, you have a new order imposed on the Arab world without warning, without consent, boundaries being drawn to meet imperial convenience, and suddenly people finding themselves no longer Ottomans, but Iraqis or Syrians or Jordanians, and struggling within these newly created boundaries that they had no say in drawing to try and achieve their independence. And I guess the next complication to that will be when Britain recognizing its own interests, and suddenly Britain wants to renegotiate the terms of Sykes-Picot and harnesses the Zionist movement to do so. This leads to the Balfour Declaration in 1917. All of these conflicting agreements, each framed in rather vague language, were designed to leave the Entente powers room to maneuver as they contemplated what a post-First World War world might look like, and would define many of the conflicts that were to shape the Middle East, none more virulently than the conflict between the Zionist movement and Palestinian Arabs over who would rule Palestine at the end of the British Mandate. This notion that imperialism was the exercise of divide and rule. And if you like, that casts the conflict over Palestine and the emergence of Israel in a central role. Israel was seen as the kind of colonial foothold for Western influence in the region, that it was a sort of human barrier separating the Asian parts of the Arab world from the North African parts of the Arab world, and that it would be an outpost of colonialism where a largely European Jewish settler community would have interests more in common with Europe than with the surrounding population. And we saw an Arab world that no sooner came out of European imperial rule in the aftermath of the Second World War than it was soon divided by politics between Arab states. These were politics that would be encouraged by a new dynamic, post-imperial, driven by the terms of a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, in which the region came to be divided between what many in the Arab world saw as progressive Arab states. These were seen by the West as radical Arab states, many of which saw military regimes brought to power by coups and revolutions. We find an Arab world which, in the aftermath of the Second World War, was to be very deeply divided within its own ranks, making it very difficult for regional organizations like the Arab League to ever exercise true influence. We saw that perhaps from the very emergence of this new order, when in 1948, a divided Arab world tried to prevent the creation of the State of Israel and to preserve Arab Palestine, and failed decisively in a war which would explode in tensions across the Arab world. The 1948 war, known as the War of Independence to Israel and as the Nakba to Palestinians. The whole notion of Nakba has taken a major reinterpretation in recent years. As a historian, we've traditionally viewed the Nakba as a specific moment in time based around 1948. First, with the civil war between Palestinian Arab and Jewish communities, in which Jewish forces prevailed, and by May of 1948 had driven hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians to seek refuge in neighboring countries. And then a second part after the British withdrawal in mid-May 1948, in which the surrounding Arab states sent their armies to try and defeat the new state of Israel and to preserve Palestinian Arab rights. And in the failure of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, we saw the consolidation of the State of Israel along the lines of the Green Line, and the State of Israel would prevent the return of the displaced Palestinians to their homes and would pass laws that would dispossess all those who had fled from all they'd left. Recently, I believe Palestinian scholars have begun to reconsider the meaning of Nakba, not as something that was confined to one historic moment, but as a process of the continuous dispossession of Palestinians that has taken place not just in 1948, but down to the present day. And that has been advanced since Oslo in the way in which the acceleration of Jewish settlers in the West Bank and the actions of the Israeli authorities against Palestinians has forced ever-increasing numbers of Palestinians to seek a better life by leaving their homeland, while, of course, millions have tenaciously clung to their homes and homelands in Palestine. Nonetheless, that there is a process being pushed by Israeli expansion into Palestinian territory that has led to increased pressure. Look at the history of Palestine and Israel from 1948 to the present, to the Oslo process, the hopes that it raised, and then the great disappointments that followed. And then the ongoing processes, whether it was the roadmap of the Bush years, the Abraham Accords of the Trump years, that all seem to compromise legitimate Palestinian rights over what is, after all, a very small part of Palestine that remains to fulfill Palestinian national aspirations. When Donald Trump was elected president, he promised that he would be able to break the impasse and resolve the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And to be honest, I believe the Palestinians had grown so disenchanted with Western initiatives up to that point, always talking about process and never delivering peace, that many actually thought that the kind of wrecking ball politics that Donald Trump brought to all issues might actually be what they needed to finally lead to a resolution. He promised the deal of a century, and I think skeptical Palestinians were willing to wait and see what he offered. But it soon became apparent that Trump was bringing to Israel-Palestine a low level of engagement and a kind of real estate man's idea of what constituted a good deal, which is all about the numbers. It's not about the rights. It doesn't really address legal or historical issues. It just tries to buy the parties' agreement to take part in the deal. His first initiative was to try and convene a meeting in Bahrain which would bring oil-wealthy Gulf states together with Palestinians and those Arab states already at peace with Israel, like Jordan and Egypt, to talk about a deal that would provide an economic future for Palestinians without really addressing their political future. And it became quite apparent that that was to be the deal of the century. And I think America's allies in the Gulf were willing to reinforce Trump's pressure to try and deliver the Palestinians to the table. I think it would have been very delegitimizing for the Palestinian Authority to have gone down that road. And Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, took what I think was the right decision not to participate in that process. And so I believe the Trump administration then decided not to be put off by Palestinian reluctance to engage, but to deliver benefits to Israel in the region and be shown to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict rather than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by getting countries that were predisposed to normalize with Israel. And that included Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And so the Trump White House was able to say that they were able to deliver peace between 4 Arab states and Israel that was ushering a whole new era in Arab-Israeli relations under America brokerage. But of course, there was always a fundamental flaw to the Abraham Accords. And the flaw is you cannot normalize with a country that isn't normal. And when I say that Israel isn't normal, I say so in quite legal terms, because what makes a country normal is to have defined boundaries. Until Israel defines the frontiers of its state, it is not a normal state. This was an impediment to the Vatican's establishing formal ties with Israel until very recently, where the Vatican simply said it would not normalize ties with Israel until Israel finalized its boundaries. It was just a reminder of what it takes to truly normalize relations. That this might lead to a new pressure on Palestinians if other Arab states were seen to normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. All this only contribute to a sense that Palestinian aspirations, so widely recognized by the international community as legitimate, but no one acting on, were now being left at the full decisive power of Israel and no end in sight, and conditions that are simply unsustainable. I feel it myself every time I visit Palestine. I was there just last spring, and every time I leave Palestine, I come away with the sense that the situation is simply not sustainable, that people cannot be expected to continue to live under such oppression. It is the oppression of having no control over your life or your movement. It is the omnipresence imposition of the occupation on daily life, on family life, on your access to health, on your access to school, on your access to work. Palestinians have been living under conditions that no one would expect, let us say, Israelis to live under. Indeed, Europeans to live under. Indeed, anyone that we have any sympathy or respect for to live under. So it wasn't a matter of anticipating 7 October. I had no idea that such a violent attack would occur. But when it happened, it seemed to me a response to the unsustainable violence of occupation. Occupation is the context. And of course, since the 7th of October, the violence against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza is being conceived both as the threat of a new Nakba, with Israeli efforts to try and pressure Egypt to open its frontiers and allow Palestinians out of Gaza as a war zone to take refuge in the Sinai away from the fighting, a move which has been resisted by Palestinians and Egypt alike as what would threaten to be the next Nakba, a displacement that would even go beyond the numbers that we saw flee Palestine in 1948. And the experience of modern history has taught Palestinians that those who leave their land are very seldom given the right to return. And so we have seen since 7 October, relations between Israel and those Arab states that exchanged ambassadors following the Abraham Accords have been very strained. Indeed, even those countries with which Israel has long-standing treaty relations, such as Jordan, have warned that were the Israelis to take such measures in Gaza as would lead to massive Palestinian flight from their territory, it would be grounds to abrogate the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. So this question of the Abraham Accords and whether one can normalize with Israel and resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict without addressing Palestinian statehood, I think has been resolved now. You cannot. And so the Abraham Accords as a process, I believe, is now on hold until a new era is ushered in through the recognition of Palestinian statehood and work to make that state a viable one at peace next to Israel. The war in Gaza is going to end, hopefully one day soon. There obviously is great pressure already on Israel to stop its hostilities. The European powers, the United States, are growing increasingly vocal. And to be honest, the threat of a new Israeli campaign in Rafah, which is truly the last corner of Gaza, with over 1 million people already refugees and trying to preserve their families against hunger, shortage of water, and a lack of medical care. And when the conflict ends, there is a universal recognition in the international community that there will need to be political changes. Now, it is hard to see how the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can be part of that future. Already, his standing was very divisive among Israelis because of changes he and his government were trying to introduce to the rule of law and the Supreme Court. But the failings of this government in Israel to protect their citizens, the failings of the intelligence services to detect a movement of such magnitude, the failing of the armed forces to be where they needed to be to protect Israeli civilians from harm, and the responsibility of the government for those failings, without doubt will lead to the fall of this government. And to be honest, when one recognizes that the aftermath of this war will lead to international discussion of Palestinian statehood, the obstruction that Netanyahu and his government have shown to any concept, any prospect of a Palestinian state means that they have no role to play in the future. So many in Israel will argue the war is being prolonged by a beleaguered prime minister who knows that as soon as the war ends, his day of reckoning will begin. But it's going to happen. So change will come to the Israeli government, but that will have to be a process that is decided by Israeli citizens, and one can only hope that it will lead not to a yet more right-wing government than what they've already had, but to a government that will be willing to work with the international community to achieve the difficult tasks ahead. On the Palestinian side, there will need to be change as well, not because the international community says so, but because Palestinians say so. Already, the perception of the failings of the Palestinian Authority runs so deep across the Palestinian body politic. The sense that the PA has really come to be subcontractor to Israel in repressing Palestinians on behalf of Israeli security, and that they've failed to deliver economic benefits or opportunities for Palestinians, let alone bring dignity to Palestinians faced with the occupation, has led many already to believe that President Mahmoud Abbas and his government must be replaced. And I can't begin to contemplate what Palestinians in Gaza have suffered, and what this will mean as a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder for the population of Gaza as a whole. You have 2.2 million PTSD sufferers in Gaza, and they will need the support and the encouragement of the international community, a support that goes well beyond providing bread and water, well beyond providing medical facilities. There's a need for healing to go on before people will be able to engage politically and take their responsibilities in part of a new order in which you'll have a sovereign Palestine next to a sovereign Israel. But that is the difficult work that must be done. I cannot, as a historian, see any alternative. I cannot see another way forward. Some talk about perhaps fusing Palestinians and Israelis into one state. But I feel that that will be too elusive in the aftermath of the deeply divisive trauma of 7 October and the Gaza war. I just don't think, as one person's opinion, that that is a realistic solution now. As a Western scholar, I always feel very conscious of my own background as I come to address the issues of divisions and responsibility within the Arab world itself. But I look to someone like the Lebanese intellectual Samir Kassir, who wrote a brilliant essay on what he diagnosed as the Arab malaise. He wrote this in the first decade of the 21st century, and it was really shaped by the sense of depression that permeated Arab political centers in the early 2000s, particularly in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror that the Americans and their allies unleashed on the Arab and Muslim worlds, and then particularly the role of America and Britain in toppling the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. Samir Kassir's point was, everyone in the Arab world recognized Saddam Hussein as a violent dictator. It was humiliating that it wasn't the Arab people themselves who had risen up against such a dictator and overthrown him. The Arab world found themselves to be acted upon rather than actors, and that the initiative was always in the hands of outside powers. To some extent, this will reflect the grip that dictators exercise in their own countries that have made Arab peoples very fearful of daring to stand up to try and impose political change. When you know that there is a network of mukhabarat, or secret police, that there are prisons in which people disappear, and if they ever reemerge, it's after they have been broken in ways that we shouldn't talk about. These are genuine disincentives for people to try and take action to address their political issues. And yet, we witnessed in 2011 a moment in which the Arab peoples took courage in their hands to challenge their dictators and demonstrated that by their own powers of organization using social media and by their strength that came in numbers, that the people indeed could speak with one voice demanding the fall of the regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. And that chant they believed in because when they looked around themselves on Avenue Bourguiba or in Midan al-Tahrir or in Midan Lulua in Bahrain or wherever else the people gathered demanding change, they found that they grew to such numbers that the power of the people had created a reversal, where instead of citizens being afraid of their governments, suddenly governments were being held accountable and now we're afraid of the people. But we saw that high hope of 2011 immediately challenged when the brave masses who took on their dictators and won created power vacuums that were very quickly filled by men with guns. And I don't say that the spirit of the Arab uprisings is over. I mean, there was a whole other wave that followed when you saw Algeria and Sudan and Lebanon and Iraq in 2019, 2020, rise up to demand change in their countries as well, a kind of second wave of Arab uprisings. And I don't believe that process is over. I look at the ongoing conflict in the Sudan and the bravery people show in confronting the military forces that are trying to deny civilians their right to representative government, to accountable government. And I know that ultimately the Arab people will prevail. But I feel like modern history, whether it is through what has gone on in the Arab world and the forces of repression that Arab states have brought to bear on their own citizens, or indeed the way in which, in an earlier age, the imperialism of the British and the French, in a later age, the client-patron relations of the Cold War, the US, the Soviet Union, and their clients in the Arab world, all served to play the regimes against the kind of change that might allow the Arab people to have a voice in their own future and to achieve their own aspirations. That was stymied right through the 20th century. We're still early in the 21st, and I remain ever optimistic that the Arab peoples will achieve the kind of future in which their place in the 21st century will be to make a massive contribution to the world of the future. I genuinely believe in the human potential and the human capital. And now we just need to see that unchained by either outside powers or repressive within their own governments.